What would you do if the man standing beside you at the altar suddenly grabbed the microphone out of the officiant's hand and told 200 guests that marrying you would be a step down for him? What would you do if he pointed across the lawn, past rows of white folding chairs and floating candles, and called for another woman to come stand beside him instead, a woman dripping in diamonds, while you stood there in your wedding gown, holding a bouquet of white peonies? Would you fall apart? Would you run? Or would you simply fold your hands in front of you, lift your chin, and wait? Because that is exactly what she did. She stood perfectly still on that manicured lawn, the ocean breeze lifting the edge of her veil, while the man she was about to marry humiliated her in front of every person who mattered to his family. What none of them knew, not the groom, not his glittering mistress, not the 200 guests exchanging delighted whispers behind champagne flutes, was that in less than 5 minutes, the private road leading to that oceanfront estate would be sealed off by a column of black armored vehicles, and the quiet woman they had just discarded like garbage was about to become the reason every single one of them lost everything they owned. Her name, the one she had used for the past 3 years, was Marion Blake. She was 27 years old, and she worked as a hospital nurse in the pediatric ward of a modest city hospital, spending her nights holding the hands of frightened children and her mornings collapsing into a narrow bed in a rented apartment above a hardware store. She wore scrubs with faded prints of cartoon animals. She carried her lunch in a paper bag. She took the subway to work, standing the entire ride because she preferred it that way, and nobody who saw her exhausted and quiet on that train would ever have guessed that her real name was Princess Isolde Rousseau, granddaughter of Supreme Monarch Alaric Rousseau, sovereign ruler of a small but staggeringly powerful island nation whose royal family controlled global shipping lanes, offshore banking networks, and a private fortune so vast that economists routinely refused to publish its full, estimated value. She had left that world deliberately, not out of rebellion, but out of exhaustion. Growing up inside marble halls and gilded ballrooms, she had learned by the age of 10 that every compliment she received came pre-measured against her title, that every friend who approached her did so with an invisible calculator running behind their eyes. Suitors arrived at the palace with business proposals disguised as courtship. Childhood friends drifted away the moment they realized friendship with a princess meant constant surveillance and constant expectation. Her grandfather, a formidable and deeply loving man, ruled his nation with unmatched precision, but even his devotion could not shield her from the isolation of being wanted only for her bloodline. At 24, she made a request that shocked the entire royal court. She asked for 3 years, just 3 years, to disappear into an ordinary life, to discover whether real love could exist without a crown attached to it. The supreme monarch, against the objections of his entire cabinet, granted her wish on one unbreakable condition. He would always know exactly where she was, always watching, always ready. That is how she met Julian Cade. He worked as a mid-level marketing executive at a boutique advertising agency, charming, driven, and in those early days, achingly attentive. She remembered their first real conversation clearly, in the hospital cafeteria, where he had come to visit a sick nephew. How he had offered her his seat when the room filled up. How he had made her laugh so hard over a terrible cafeteria sandwich that she nearly choked. He called her the following week, and the week after that, and within 2 months, he had become the quiet center of her ordinary, carefully constructed life. He told her once, lying beside her on a rooftop under a blanket during a summer thunderstorm, that he didn't care about money, that all he wanted was someone who understood the value of small, honest moments. She believed him entirely. She let herself fall in love slowly, deliberately, savoring the rare, precious sensation of being wanted for nothing more than herself. But somewhere between the first year and the third, something shifted in Julian, and that shift arrived wearing a name, Ophelia Vance. Ophelia was the daughter of a real estate developer, a woman who moved through rooms like she was perpetually being photographed, her wardrobe a rotating exhibit of designer labels, her wrists heavy with bracelets that caught the light like small, deliberate weapons. She reappeared in Julian's professional circle roughly a year before the wedding, her family's development company suddenly interested in strategic marketing partnerships with Julian's agency, a convenient excuse that placed her in his office, his meetings, and eventually his evenings with increasing frequency. Julian's mother, Regina Cade, adored her instantly. Regina was the kind of woman who treated her son's engagement to Marion as a temporary inconvenience rather than a settled fact, greeting her at family dinners with a tight, performative smile and comments dressed as compliments. "You look so comfortable in that dress," Regina said once, eyeing the simple navy sheath Marion had worn to a family gathering. "Not everyone can pull off something so practical." The cruelties accumulated slowly, deliberately, the way water erodes stone. Regina corrected Marion's table manners in front of guests. She accidentally seated her at the far end of family dinners, near the kitchen door. She once handed Marion a folded stack of bills before a company gala, saying loudly enough for the caterers to hear, "Get yourself something appropriate, dear. We can't have you embarrassing Julian in front of his colleagues." Ophelia's presence made everything sharper. She began attending the same events, always seated closer to Julian than protocol required, always laughing a little too warmly at jokes that weren't particularly funny, always finding a reason to touch his arm when she spoke. Marion noticed everything, the way nurses learn to notice small changes in vital signs long before a crisis becomes visible. She noticed the new cologne Julian wore to networking dinners. She noticed how his phone, once left carelessly on the counter, now stayed locked in his jacket pocket. She noticed the receipts from restaurants he claimed were client meetings, restaurants with candlelight and tasting menus that cost more than her monthly rent. When she finally asked him directly, one quiet evening, in their small apartment, he grew defensive immediately. "You're imagining things," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Ophelia's family is important to the agency right now. I can't afford to alienate her over your insecurities. Please, Marion, just trust me. Things are tight at work. I need you to be supportive right now, not paranoid." She swallowed the accusation as she had swallowed so many others, telling herself that love required patience, that ambition sometimes demanded sacrifice, that she was simply seeing shadows where there was only stress. She did not know, could not have known, that she was watching the slow, careful construction of her own public execution. The wedding was planned for a Saturday in late spring at a sprawling oceanfront estate that Regina had insisted on booking, waving away Marion's gentle suggestion of something smaller with a dismissive flick of her manicured hand. "This is a Cade family event," Regina had said. "It needs to reflect our standing." 200 guests were invited, seated beneath a canopy of white orchids strung between marble columns overlooking the sea, the late afternoon sun casting a warm golden light across rows of folding chairs upholstered in ivory silk. Ophelia Vance was inexplicably seated in the front row, a placement Marion questioned and was told, coldly, was a professional courtesy given her family's continued investment in the agency. The morning of the wedding, Marion stood in a small dressing room overlooking the ocean, wearing a simple gown of ivory chiffon, unembellished, elegant in its restraint. Her hands did not tremble. A quiet, cold certainty had been building in her chest for weeks, the particular stillness that comes right before something breaks completely. She said nothing to anyone. She simply walked toward the aisle when the string quartet began to play, her posture perfectly composed, utterly unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that 2 black government-issue phones, hidden among the catering staff, were already streaming a live encrypted feed to a private jet currently making its final descent toward a nearby royal airstrip. The ceremony space was breathtaking, white orchids cascading from marble columns, the Atlantic stretching out behind the altar in a sheet of hammered silver light, the scent of salt air mixing with warm candle wax and expensive perfume. Marion walked down the aisle alone, no family present that she claimed as her own. Her chin lifted, her spine straight in a way that made more than one guest whisper about her surprising poise for someone so ordinary. Julian stood at the altar in a pale gray suit, and when their eyes met, Marion felt, for one final fragile moment, a flicker of the old warmth. She told herself she was safe. She told herself her doubts had been wrong. They had not been wrong. The justice of the peace, a small silver-haired woman with a warm smile, guided them through the opening remark, welcoming the guests, speaking briefly about love and commitment before reaching for her small stack of ceremony cards. Just as she opened her mouth to begin the formal vows, Julian reached out and gently, deliberately, took the microphone from her hand. A ripple of confused murmurs moved through the crowd. The officiant blinked, startled, stepping back half a pace, unsure whether to intervene. "I need to say something," Julian announced, his voice amplified across the lawn, carrying out over the assembled guests and the soft crash of waves below the bluff. "Before we go any further." Regina, seated in the front row in a shimmering emerald gown, folded her hands in her lap and smiled. The smile of a woman watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. "Marion," Julian continued, and Marion noted with strange clinical detachment that he still would not quite look at her, his eyes sliding instead toward the front row, toward Ophelia Vance, who sat with her chin lifted and a small, knowing smile curling at the edge of her glossed lips. "I've been trying to convince myself for months that this was the right decision, but standing here, I can't keep lying to everyone in front of me." The guests had gone utterly silent. 200 people frozen mid-breath, champagne flutes suspended halfway to open mouths. "The truth is," Julian said, his voice gaining a strange, unsettling confidence, "I can't marry down. I've worked too hard to build the life she's a good person, she's kind, but she's a nurse, Marion. She rents an apartment above a hardware store. My mother was right. This would be a step backward for everything I've built." He turned then, extending his hand toward the front row, toward Ophelia, who rose slowly from her seat, smoothing the front of a dress that shimmered like liquid platinum in the afternoon light, diamond earrings catching fire in the sun. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a man laughed, a short, delighted bark quickly stifled behind a napkin. "Ophelia," Julian said, gesturing for her to join him at the altar, "come stand with me. This is who I should have chosen from the beginning." Regina rose to her feet, clapping slowly, deliberately, the sound echoing strangely across the open lawn. "Finally," she announced to the guests at large, "some honesty." "Darling," she said, turning her cold gaze toward Marion, "you can keep the flowers. Consider it a parting gift. Try not to make a scene on your way out." Laughter rippled through scattered pockets of the crowd, cruel and delighted. The laughter of people who believed wealth made them untouchable. Laughter that would, within minutes, curdle into something close to panic. Marion did not cry. She stood perfectly still at the altar, her bouquet of white peonies hanging loosely from her fingers, the ocean wind lifting the edge of her veil in slow, deliberate wave. Her face did not crumple. Her eyes did not fill with tears. She simply looked at Julian, then at Ophelia, then at Regina, with an expression so calm, so utterly devoid of the devastation they expected, that a strange unease began rippling backward through the rows of guests, whispers passing from chair to chair. Something was wrong. This woman was supposed to be sobbing, supposed to be fleeing down the aisle in shame. Instead, she reached into the small satin clutch, looped around her wrist, and withdrew a plain black phone, unmarked, unbranded, a single button glinting on its side. She pressed it once. "What is she doing?" Ophelia whispered, her triumphant smile faltering for the briefest moment. Regina rolled her eyes. "Calling a taxi, presumably," she sneered. "Go on, dear. Don't keep it waiting." Marion looked at Julian one final time, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet. But the officiant's microphone, still clipped to Julian's lapel, carried every word clearly across the silent lawn. "You should have asked who my grandfather is," she said, "before you decided which woman was beneath you." Julian blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "Your grandfather. You told me your family was gone. You told me—" "I told you what I needed you to believe," Marion said. "For 3 years, I wanted to know if you could love someone with nothing. You just answered that question in front of 200 witnesses. Somewhere beyond the estate's iron gates, a sound began to build, faint at first, like distant thunder rolling in off the water, growing steadily louder, a deep mechanical rumble that made the crystal glasses on nearby tables tremble faintly against their saucers. Guests turned in their chairs, craning toward the long gravel driveway leading up from the coastal road, where a line of headlights had begun to appear, multiplying rapidly, closing in with terrifying speed. The estate's wrought iron gates burst open. A column of vehicles surged up the driveway, more than 20 of them, matte black and impossibly heavy, flags mounted on their hoods snapping in the ocean wind, bearing a golden crest that made several older guests, particularly those with international shipping interests, rise halfway from their seats in instinctive, ancient recognition. "That's the Rousseau crest," someone near the back murmured, disbelief cracking through his voice. "That's the royal seal of the Sovereign Isles." The vehicles halted in a precise, disciplined formation along the edge of the lawn, and dozens of men in tactical black uniforms emerged in perfect unison, moving with the terrifying discipline of Royal Marines trained from adolescence for exactly this kind of intervention, fanning out along the perimeter of the ceremony space, sealing every possible exit. At the center of the formation, walking calmly up the aisle between rows of frozen, disbelieving guests, came an elderly man in a formal naval coat, gold braid gleaming at his shoulders, his silver hair perfectly combed, his ice-blue eyes fixed directly on Julian Cade. Supreme Monarch Alaric Rousseau had arrived. "Grandfather," Marion said softly, and for the first time since the ceremony began, warmth flickered briefly across her composed expression. The monarch reached her side and took her hand gently between both of his weathered palms. "I told you I would always be watching, little one," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the stunned lawn, a voice built over decades of command. "I let this go further than I should have. I needed you to see clearly, once and for all, exactly what this man was." He turned then, deliberately, to face Julian, who stood frozen at the altar, the officiant's microphone still clutched uselessly in his trembling hand, his face drained of every trace of its earlier confidence. "Give me that," the monarch said, and reached out, plucking the microphone directly from Julian's fingers with the calm, absolute authority of a man who had never once in his life been refused. He turned to face the assembled guests, his voice rolling out across the lawn and down toward the sea. "Do you know who this woman is?" he asked. "You called her a step backward. You called her unworthy of standing beside you. Let me correct that mistake in front of everyone gathered here to witness her humiliation." He raised his free hand, and a guard stepped forward, presenting a leather folder, which the monarch opened for the crowd to see. "This is my granddaughter, Princess Isolde Rousseau, heir to the throne of the Sovereign Isles, controlling shareholder of the Rousseau Maritime Trust, and beneficiary of a personal fortune exceeding $5 trillion. His gaze swept coldly across the frozen rows of guests. For 3 years, she asked to live as an ordinary woman, working nights in a children's hospital, to discover whether anyone could love her without knowing any of this. She chose you, Mr. Cade, and you spent 3 years pretending to be a man worth choosing, right up until the moment you decided, in front of 200 witnesses, to trade her for a woman wearing borrowed diamonds. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Ophelia had gone rigid beside him, her platinum gown suddenly looking cheap and desperate under the weight of the monarch's words. "Borrowed," the monarch repeated, and something almost like amusement flickered across his weathered face. "Because my intelligence office completed a full financial review of both of you this morning, as a matter of routine diligence, before allowing my granddaughter anywhere near a legal marriage contract. Mr. Cade, Your advertising agency is 11 months behind on payroll taxes and currently facing dissolution proceedings you have concealed from your own family. And you, Miss Vance, he turned his gaze toward her, watching her flinch beneath it. Your father's development company defaulted on 3 separate loans issued through Rousseau Maritime Trust's banking division 14 months ago. Those loans were extended under unusually generous terms I authorized personally, as a courtesy to a business partner I believed operated with integrity. That's impossible, Regina interjected, rising from her seat, her earlier triumph curdling rapidly into panic. Julian told us he made partner at the firm. He told us the wedding was fully paid for by his own accounts. Everything you were told was a fabrication, the Monarch said flatly. Your son has been borrowing against a company that no longer generates revenue, financing an image of success entirely on credit. Credit that, as of this morning, my office has called in fully, effective immediately. Julian finally found his voice, stumbling forward off the altar steps, falling to his knees on the sun-warmed stone amid the scattered white petals that had drifted loose from the floral arch above him. Please, he choked, reaching toward Marion. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were. If I had known... If you had known, Marion said, and the entire lawn seemed to lean in to hear her, you would have loved me for the crown, instead of loving me at all. That is precisely why I never told you. I wanted to know what kind of man you were when you thought no one worth impressing was watching. Today, in front of 200 guests, you answered that question more honestly than you ever have in 3 years. She looked down at him. This man who had once made her laugh over a terrible cafeteria sandwich, now kneeling on warm stone, stripped in a single revelation of every illusion he had built his entire adult identity upon. You didn't fail me today, Julian. You failed the moment you decided my worth could be measured against a woman's jewelry. I simply made sure the whole world was watching when the truth caught up with you. She turned toward Ophelia, whose earlier confidence had entirely evaporated, replaced by the ashen expression of a woman calculating, in real time, the collapse of everything she had assumed was permanent. As for you, Marion said quietly, I hope the diamonds were at least real. It seems they may be the only thing you have left by tomorrow morning. She turned finally to Regina, who stood frozen, her emerald gown suddenly looking absurd against the wreckage unfolding around her. You told me to try not to make a scene on my way out, Marion said. I won't need to. My grandfather already made one for me. She turned, the hem of her gown brushing softly against the white petals scattered across the stone, and took her grandfather's arm. Regina collapsed backward into her chair, her hands trembling against her lap. Ophelia had already begun edging toward the side of the lawn, her heels sinking unsteadily into the grass, her earlier grace entirely abandoned. Marion walked back down the aisle she had walked up as a bride only minutes before, past 200 stunned faces, past the family that had spent months grinding her dignity into dust, and out toward the edge of the bluff, where the convoy of black armored vehicles waited, engines humming steadily, Royal Marines standing at rigid attention along a path leading directly to the open door of the lead vehicle. She did not look back. She did not need to. Behind her, the oceanfront lawn had become a monument to an engagement built entirely on borrowed money and manufactured status, a monument that had taken 3 years to construct and less than 10 minutes to collapse into ruin. The convoy pulled away from the estate's gravel driveway, 22 black SUVs moving in perfect formation down the coastal road, small golden flags snapping crisply against the salt wind. Inside the lead vehicle, Marion finally allowed herself to exhale, resting her head against the cool leather seat, her grandfather's hand steady and warm over hers. You did not cry, the Monarch observed quietly, watching her with careful, searching eyes. I stopped crying for men who measure love in property values, Marion replied. You taught me that patience a long time ago, watching you govern an empire without ever needing to raise your voice. The Monarch smiled, a small, weathered, proud smile. True power, he said, does not need to shout. It only needs to wait, patient as the tide, until the moment arrives to reclaim what was always hers. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through elite circles across 2 continents, whispered at charity galas and closed boardroom dinners, a cautionary tale about mistaking borrowed wealth for real power. Julian Cade's agency was formally dissolved within days, his name quietly erased from every professional network that had once celebrated his rise. Regina Cade sold her jewelry within a month, simply to cover outstanding debts her son had hidden from her for years, moving into a modest rental far from the social circles that had once fought for her attention. Ophelia Vance's family development empire collapsed within 3 weeks, exactly as the Monarch had promised, swallowed entirely by the very financial network that had once extended it such generous terms. None of them ever heard from Marian again. She did not gloat. She did not celebrate publicly. She simply returned to the palace that had always been waiting for her, stepped fully into the role she had spent 3 years quietly preparing to claim, and never once looked back at the oceanfront lawn, the stolen microphone, or the man who had knelt weeping on warm stone, begging for a mercy that had already run out. True power, she had learned, does not need to shout. It only needs to remember and to wait. What did you think of this masterful revenge? Did Julian Cade get exactly what he deserved, kneeling on that stone terrace with nothing left to his name? If you loved watching arrogant elites lose absolutely everything in front of the very crowd they tried to impress, smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of karma, justice, and quiet, devastating power.